there's a real feeling of business as usual since a bullet was dodged, if you will, at the election. So people are just going about their business, and even the politicians are going about their business. They're expressing great urgency at the need to form a government, but right now we're going into day 2, and the leaders of the parties who are going to need to urgently form a coalition are going about their business, holding meetings, doing their horse trading, and except for the vast numbers of journalists here, there really is a feeling of business as usual.
It's quite interesting, James, you say since the bullet was dodged, and a couple of people have been saying to us that all it is really just kicking the can further down the road. This will catch up with Greece in a matter of months.
Well, that's another very powerful image, and one that unless it continues to get more help from the rest of Europe, that very well may be the case that can is going to go over the cliff, if you'll forgive the metaphor.
And talking about the can over the cliff, what is it that Europe should do for Greece, do you think?
Well, what I think is, I'm not allowed to have opinions because I'm a journalist, but what seems to the core of the problem is in Europe is you have a bunch of separate nations carrying on their own policies. However, it's halfway towards a real union, and the countries that have conducted themselves responsibly from the point of view of their national budgets, they don't want to be in the position of having to provide more support to the countries that haven't. And yet that is really the step that has to happen, and they have to come to terms with that. Otherwise, the experts we speak to, the economists, the political scientists, say that this European construction that began after World War II and has been one of the great experiments of human history will come to an end.
And that is why there's been a lot of pressure then on German Chancellor Angela Merkel to intervene more decisively in this regard.
That's exactly right. And in fact, she has opposition even at home. The opposition party is pushing for her to do more. However, there's her political party and her political base is very much opposed indeed to providing more aid to countries around the periphery of Europe.
That's interesting. Let me come back to Dr. Abedian. Then we've heard an announcement here this morning in South Africa that South Africa has committed $2 billion in this regard. What are your thoughts initially?
I think it's part of South Africa being an international citizen and being a member of IMF. It has to play its role. So that's the context in which South Africa has to play its role. Incidentally, Kolani, if you think 2 billion has raised so much emotions, imagine if you were running this show in Germany, that every week 10 billion, 20 billion, 100 billion has to be sort of pledged for Spain, for Italy, for Greece. Imagine the surge of emotions there. So I think it is a political issue. It's also a risk mitigation issue. Clearly, the rate at which the European problem is spreading globally, bringing the global growth down from above 5% to below 4%, possibly around 3.6, 3.7 at the moment. That means a lot of countries are going to run into balance of payments problem. And therefore, not only the European countries, but some African countries, some Asian countries will run into this problem. And IMF is designed to sort out those type of problems. And therefore, they have to get their acts together, resource it in anticipation, and South Africa is playing a part in that regard.
But Dr. Abedian, I think people would want to hear perhaps whether Greece is not just a bottomless pit, that we're throwing this money and this is not going to end. What is the end game, though?
The end game is, unfortunately, the Europeans have to agree on. It's a political end game. They got to accept that you cannot have single currency without some fiscal union, however loosely or tightly designed, a federal system of some sort, whether it's like the U.S. Type of federal fiscal system or another variations, until and unless the Europeans cross that bridge openly and in a way transparently and technically correctly, they're going to go from one crisis to another. And it absolutely boggles the mind as to how they think they can just find a solution by delaying and procrastination.
I'm going to come back to Dr. Hawkins in a minute, but James, let me go back to you then. Your response to what Dr. Abedian is saying here, because you probably will be talking to a lot of analysts about the political moves and the steps that need to be taken in this regard.
Well, that's right. He phrased the problem and the solution very well indeed. Everything is a half measure until there's a sense of that there's a political endgame, and that's what the markets are waiting for. The officials here, the president of the central bank, Mario Draghi, has referred to a report that was written in 1989 that laid out the steps that would emerge 13 years later in the euro, and that's the kind of thing that might be necessary. That there's not going to be a solution today or tomorrow or next week or next year, but if there's a sense that at the end of the road there's a real fiscal union, that's the kind of step that markets are waiting for.
But take us as ordinary people through that. Why would the fiscal union make a difference?
That's a great question, and it's somewhat easier for me to answer because you may or may not be able to tell I'm an American, and I'm an American from New York State.
Yeah.
So New York State pays much more in taxes than it collects in revenue. The wealth that New York State generates helps support fellow citizens in other states, in Mississippi, in Alabama, in Montana, for example, which are some states in the U.S. And nobody complains. It's the part of being in the federal union, and we all benefit from each other. In Europe, for example, Germany has benefited tremendously from their ability to export to fast-growing economies or economies that were fast-growing. In Spain, for example, and in Greece during the most of the first decade of the 21st century, and they benefit from a union. And what they have to do is recognize that there's a shared fate, and that's the political piece. And the budgetary piece is some economies are just much more competitive than others.
All right, let me come back to Dr. Hawkins. Our Finance Minister, Pravin Gordhan, Dr. Hawkins, was quoted as saying, not only is he watching what's going on in Europe with trepidation, but also he says with repeated bouts of hope and despair. I understand despair, but I'm not sure about hope. Are you hopeful?
Well, I think, basically what happens is that when you have a crisis like this, at some stage people realize they have to take charge. And I think what has been happening for quite a few months, even years, has been there's almost been a sense of denial. I remember when I was studying in Scotland not so long ago, I remember that there was a huge draw on EU funds in countries like Scotland and Ireland and, of course, Greece, where EU funds in the boom times were used to build infrastructure in those countries. So you'd find these magnificent roads in rural Scotland, which nobody quite understood why they were there, but there would be a big sign saying this was funded by EU funds. Oh. And I think the problem is that part of what's been going on with the EU is a bit like perhaps the banking crisis in the US at the beginning. There was this kind of sense of denial. It can't really be happening to us, and things are going to improve. And also, of course, it builds into that narrative that certainly deluded the people in the US in the subprime markets that there's only one way up, or one way, and that's up in the economy. And I think with the EU process, people have been kind of really like ostriches. Let's not look at the reality because it will get better. I think now what is happening in the G20 meetings is that the world leaders are saying to the Eurozone, actually, guys, we are really worried about this, and better you take it seriously and do something about it. And, I mean, just like James and Derocha said, we need a very detailed program. It's not enough to say there is money in the kitty. I mean, remember what we're dealing with here is dealing with uncertainty of the markets. And the way in which you deal with that is that you say we've got some strengths, and that's important. You've got to have money in the kitty. That's important. But it's also very important to be able to calm the markets by saying this is the program. We're going to do this in the short term. We're going to do this in the medium term. And this is our long-term vision. And unless you actually spell it out, people are unnerved by the fact that, first of all, we hear that Greece has got a deficit 3 times that it should be in terms of the Maastricht Treaty, and then it's 4 times, and then maybe it could be even higher than that. And so people are saying, well, we'll throw some money at it. But unless we understand how Greece is going to repay, how we're going to deal directly with Spain, what's going to happen in the Italian solution, we get locked up into this uncertainty. And, of course, with uncertainty you have both hopes and fears. Yeah. But the issue is that unless you can retain a period, hopefulness for a certain period of time, you're not going to emerge out of it.
But what should we do then? What lessons should we learn from this ongoing situation?
I mean, there are many, many lessons. One is that whenever there is some experimentation such as Euro, you can't do it half-baked. And now at home, there are lessons to be learned. If we dealing, for example, for us, a major item at the moment in terms of our infrastructure backlog is that we cannot do half-baked stuff. We cannot go half-measure. We got to think it through. We got to apportion it, and the government should not finance what it should not finance. Otherwise, down the line, we're going to have fiscal liabilities that are not sustainable, and of course, then fiscal conditions become unsustainable. The poor suffer the most, and it leads to political instability.
All right, let me read some emails. Then Stu Motlamini, the president of COSATU, has sent in an email that says public servants cannot accept that government will give this money to the IMF, and I think this is going to be quite interesting. He says the public servants cannot accept that government will give this money to the IMF to bail out the developed world when at home only 6.5% is offered to them. That's COSATU president Stu Motlamini on email. Dr. Hawkins, quickly just respond to this, because there are a lot of SMSs and emails about this 2 billion commitment that the South African government has made.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I think we just need to make quite clear that this is not money that's coming out of the budget. So in other words, we're not pulling money out of the budget that would have been given to salary increases or expansion in capital expenditure and improvement of roads. This is money that has been, if you like, it's our international savings. So it's as if we've got foreign exchange reserves, and we have committed that if there is such a need, we will be prepared to extend. It's like a guarantee. It's like a surety that we've given. It's not a payment that's gone into anybody else's account at this stage. It's a commitment that we will contribute this money, but then it will have to be repaid in terms of international rules. So it's like we're prepared to give this money on the grounds that it will be loaned from us and repaid. Remember what we're doing here is remember I spoke earlier and I said when you've got uncertainty, you've got various things that you've got to deal with. And one of the things that you've got to try and do, remember how I would like to just talk about some of the comments that come from Alex and Raj again at some stage. But really the big thing there is that in the banking system as we have in South Africa and throughout the world, the reason it works is because people believe it will work.